Hello, folks. Welcome to another episode of the Ninjutsu podcast. I'm your host, Don Rowley. This time around, we're going to go back on a subject that I covered earlier, the subject of Yasuke, and kind of update with a few little things. And also, I'm going to try to use this as an example, as a case to explain historical fiction and the way the Japanese sometimes do it very differently than how we do it in America and Europe. Now, and if you haven't seen my first podcast talking about Yasuke, go back and watch it. I'd suggest you do that. In essence, I completely destroy Thomas Lockley and his book that is often quoted. And I pointed out that, he made up stuff. And it's provable that he just made this stuff up. And, but yet still, he the book is available in English, but there's a version that's also available in Japanese. And a lot of the people that have racist agendas are pointing out, like, well, how can dispute a book that was published in Japan? Don't you think the Japanese what they're talking about? Again, this is the logical fallacy of appeals with authority, but again, got to get back to the fact that this is historical fiction. That's how it was released in Japan. Now, since I came out with my podcast just about the time that Ubisoft came out with an Assassin's Creed game set in feudal Japan. And to say that it set off a firestorm in Japan is an understatement. The Japanese are furious about I can only call it a racist attitude of the people at Ubisoft toward the Japanese. The complete and utter disregard for their culture, their history, everything. A lot of Japanese are pointing out these are a bunch of white women trying to lecture the Japanese about how things should have gone on in Japan, which is pretty damn racist if you think about it. Okay, and someone needs to say it, that these people have a complete disregard for Japan, and when they talk about diversity, they obviously never even had a single Japanese person working on a game that was set in Japan. Okay? The Japanese Diet, which is their government body, is debating it. There's politicians that are calling to ban the game. I don't think they're going to get too far with that. There's investigations. And Thomas Lockley seems to have lost his job as an associate professor. He's taken down his social media stuff. He seems to have gone into hiding. He's been found to do a lot of questionable things about credentials and references, modifying Wikipedia and stuff like that. Yeah, and I was, before this all happened, I was saying that he was a fraud, that he was making things up. And yeah, the Japanese are really mad, really, really mad about just the way that the complete disregard for facts when it came to making this game. And of course, the people at Ubisoft, being what they are, doubled down and said that the Japanese didn't like it because they're racist, which is not quite the tactic that you find in the book How to Win Friends and Influence People. But really, it comes down to the fact that it's not just about Yasuke. It's about a whole lot of things that that they just did not check. They did not think important enough to ask someone that could answer questions or check things. I mean, I've heard that there's one Japanese person that was dealing with like intergenerational relationships or something like that. But if they had just brought in standard Japanese, not even people with degrees in history or anything like that, they could have caught quite a bit of this stuff. I mean, one case in point, there's scenes in the movie or the game where there's cherry blossoms and blooms as the peasants plant their rice. And the thing is that all Japanese, I mean, maybe not 3-year-olds or stuff like that, but all Japanese know that you do not plant rice when the cherry blossoms are still in bloom. If you want your crop to survive and you not starve to death after the next harvest, you wait several weeks. There is all the Japanese go to festivals around cherry blossoms. They know when the cherry blossoms in bloom. And they know that several weeks later, there's what's called Golden Week, which is a series of holidays. And this is when the farmers plant their crops during Golden Week, not when the cherry blossoms in bloom. This is standard stuff. This is what Joe Tanaka knows. And there's other things like, they're using the torii that you use in Shintos for everything other than a Shinto shrine. Just a complete and absolute disregard for the Japanese as a people, their society, their culture, everything. And it's got to be called out that people at Ubisoft are racist, okay? And they are catering to racists. They are a bunch of white saviors coming in telling the Japanese how things went, which are totally wrong, then doubling down and insulting them when the Japanese try to point things out, which really did not go over well. Now, I mentioned that, Lockley is disgraced. Forget about him. But one thing that people are still saying, okay, well, the Wakanda Forever types, the black people uber alles types. It's like, well, he published a book in Japan. This book was published in Japan. How could, that happen? How would the Japanese not know about this? Well, aside from the fact that, really, until this game really put things in the spotlight, the book wasn't really all that popular. But the main thing is that it was in Japan, it is listed as historical fiction. Okay, what he wrote in Japan, in Japanese, is historical fiction. Whereas the book released here, I got the book from the library. It had the Dewey Decimal System number on the side. The Dewey Decimal System number is used for nonfiction books. Nonfiction meaning true. And it's not. It is historical fiction in Japan. And this is kind of a little bit of confusion. This is what I want to make a lesson out of, is the way that the Japanese differ in the way they do historical fiction than what we do. Okay, so when we do historical fiction, there's different types. And there's a lot of overlap. Okay, so first of all, there's a lot of stories set in historical settings, back in history, 100 years ago. So westerns, stuff like that. Yes, actually, westerns will be over 100 years now. I'm kind of dating myself. Yes, there was a battle at the OK Corral, right? But there's got to be 10,000 gunfights in movies and television for every one that happened in real life in the American West. So yeah, again, it's fiction, and we understand that. And again, Japanese do the same thing. There are swordsmen that never existed on vendettas that never happened, and we understand this. It's all fiction. It's set in a timeline. It conforms to the fact of that timeline, but it never happened, and we all know that. The difference is that in America and Europe, they tend to be very cautious about using actual historical figures in these types of stories. If you make a story, let's say about Winston Churchill, and you get some fact about him off, you're going to have all these Professor Fox words. Yes, this is an atrocity. This is stuff like that. Okay, so they tend to use the historical characters in I'm thinking about like the movie A Bridge Too Far. Winston Churchill, I do believe, is in there, but very minor character, so they don't do too much. Of course, they make movies like Patton, and there's a lot of, speculation of what conversation really had, what real motivations, but it follows the general line of what happened with General Patton. You're not really going to find too many stories of any type in America or Europe about, say, that Ben Franklin on his famous trip to France on a diplomatic mission at night helped the French government uncover and defeat a plot that would, overthrow them and bring the British in, and thus, isolate the Americas even more. That didn't happen, and they're not going to make a story about that, even though this story supposedly was a secret mission and would not have been written down in history. The Japanese do that. Okay, they do take an actual historical figure, historical situation, and then, well, nobody wrote about this, but maybe it could have happened when nobody noticed. Secret missions or whatever, stuff like that. As you can imagine, anime takes it to quite an extreme. This movie, Wrath of the Ninja in English, is called Yotoden in English. It's one of the first anime movies I watched back in the day. In it, according to this movie, Oda Nobunaga, which was the guy that asked the Jesuit to give him the slave Yasuke, he didn't really die at Honnoji, as history writes. That was a kagemusha, a body double, a decoy. And the real Oda Nobunaga, according to this, was possessed by demons as part of an invasion of Earth from the demonic planes. But of course, the heroes in it managed to destroy this invasion and defeat Oda Nobunaga's demon before anyone at large knew of the threat. Yeah, this is yeah, this again, this is the type of thing that you see in Japanese cinema and such. You have to suspend a certain amount of belief. Of course, the Japanese know there's no demonic invasion. They also know that, like, Matsuo Basho, one of the greatest haiku artists, wasn't actually a ninja that went around with a band of people and found secrets out. But there is a television series that happened called Onmitsu Oko no Hosomichi, which I used to tease my Japanese literature teacher about when we were studying Basho, and things like that. Again, it's in the margins. Nobody supposedly wrote these things down, so maybe they happened. But again, a certain amount of suspension of disbelief, just like when you watch the Harry Potter movies. And yeah, you can believe in dragons, you can believe in flying around on brooms, you can believe in Quidditch, and just suspend disbelief and enjoy the movie. And the Japanese, but you know, just laser swords in Star Wars and stuff like that. Again, a certain amount of suspension of disbelief, belief is necessary to enjoy Harry Potter movies, Star Wars movies. With me, I can believe all that. I can suspend disbelief for that. But the idea of a teenage boy with a invisibility cloak, not even thinking of getting into the the girls' shower room, nah, that's a little bit too much for me to believe. And of course, the Japanese know Japanese history. I mean, they study Japanese history for years in school, and so they know that Matsuo Basho was not actually a ninja. That's stuff like that, and this is very popular in Japan. And again, if you're watching this because you want to learn about Japan, you want to move there, you want to speak the language, there are certain things that you have to know that are not taught in textbooks, language textbooks. Okay, if you are going to America, you need to learn English, but you also need to know who Bugs Bunny was, because the first time what's up, Doc, or what a Nimrod, you need to know these references. Okay, so I'm bringing this up when I'm going to talk about Mitoan. And Mitoan was an actual picture that character. Went generally by another name. He was a member of the Tokugawa family. He was a branch family that was supposed to, if the main family didn't have any heirs, then the branch family would send someone in. And this is actually what happened with the last shogun. But the real Mitoan was a scholar. He published a lot of books. But there's a television series called Mitoan, where he and his band of adventurers travel around Japan, thwarting plots against the shogun, solving crimes and all that. And the funny thing about it is that, like, every episode at exactly, I think it's 43 minutes after the hour, all the Mitoan and his band is in a raging battle with all these bad guys, and Mitoan looks at one of his guys and says, "Show him it," and the guy pulls out a travel thing with the Tokugawa crest, the ruling family of Japan, and says, "Can't you see that this man is?" And immediately all the villains drop their weapons, get down, and just like beg forgiveness. Again, if you've never seen Mitoan, you're going to find references where they make fun of this and make reference to it, like a kid walking through to the halls of the school, and the teacher stops him, and the kid pulls out the hall pass. "Can't you see?" Or a police officer, "Can't you see my badge?" Or something like that. So yeah, so if you haven't, maybe there's episodes of Mitoan on YouTube that you can watch it. If you are interested in learning about Japan, going to Japan, and understanding these Japanese references, yeah, this is it. But the main point is that I want to make is, again, Lockley released his book in Japan as historical fiction. Okay, he had some sidebars and stuff like that where he really talked about how things really were with the Jesuits and stuff like that. But it was understood. It is understood in Japan that this was not a real story. This was, again, the stuff that I in my last podcast where I talked about how Oda Nobunaga went to visit the aftermath of the Battle of Iga, and he got ambushed by all these ninja that came out of the ground, and he had to fight side by side with Yasuke. Didn't happen, okay? If it had happened, somebody would have written it down. But the Lockley novel in Japanese kind of had that suspension of belief. And yeah, nobody wrote it down, but again, nobody said it didn't happen, so let's just have fun and have this great fight scene. Okay, that's it. So if you're thinking about Lockley being a reference, again, he's been discredited in Japan. His work in Japan was presented as fiction that is based on historical characters, not the absolute facts on them. And that's the thing. It should never have been released in outside of Japan as a nonfiction book. Okay, but it really is that kind of like that niche that you find in a lot of things. I mean, you will find novels and stories, magazine series where they will tell a story and then they will have like this is the historical background of this, and of course this story actually didn't happen, but this institution that he's fighting against, they did exist, and these are the facts we know about it. Teaches a little bit of history, good story. If you want a great example of this, I suggest you find the comic Lone Wolf and Cub. Many libraries have it if you don't, but again, the stuff they talk about, like the institutions, may be a little bit exaggerated, but they actually happen. I mean, like the people that had to carry people across rivers because the Tokugawa government didn't want bridges built too often because they were worried about armies marching over them. I first learned about that through Lone Wolf and Cub, and then you find a movie called After the Rain, Ame Agari, and that's a very important part of the story. So yeah, this exists in Japan. Things that will teach a bit of history, but are considered historical fiction. And Yasuke is did exist, but he was not a samurai. I mean, just the name Yasuke. Okay, samurai warriors had a family name and a given name. Yasuke only had one name. That's what peasants and slaves had. Okay, he was given a short sword, not a long sword. A long sword, if he was given a long sword, he was a samurai. Okay, just these things are you know history is important. When you try to change history, you try to change a lot of things. And when we've seen attempts to change history, really doesn't ever end well. So that basically that's it. Now, if there's a point about Yasuke that you want answered, or you want to bring my attention to some of this storm going on, questions about anything, put them in the comments section. Go ahead, like, subscribe if you want. I'm not too big on that, but just remember, if somebody tries to throw Lockley in your face and says his book was published in Japan, send him this video. And tell him that it was historical fiction, and this is what the Japanese do. Okay, and with that, I'm going to end it here, and I'll see you next time. Good day.